Welcome back, everyone. It's now time to kick off our fourth panel of the day, Influencers as Bridge Builders. A quick reminder that the full event program, presenter bios, and abstracts can be found by scanning the QR code that is currently on screen. This panel has 5 presentations that explore how influencers can facilitate cultural and political bridging across geographical, ideological, and other such divides. Let's welcome our first presenter from this panel, Fotini MASTROIANNI. Fotini, the screen is yours, and I invite you to share your slides.
So thank you for the invitation to be part of this symposium. My name is Fotini MASTROIANNI, and I'm a researcher based in Greece with a background in economics and business management. And importantly for today, over a decade of experience as an independent blogger. This is the third time I have presented research grounded in my blogging experience. What I'm presenting today is titled Bloggers as Informal Diplomatic Actors, Opinion Leadership, Influence and Public Diplomacy in the Greek Digital Sphere. It is grounded in both academic literature and my own practice as a digital writer with over 550,000 page views. I want to start with a question that I think is central to this symposium. Who counts as a diplomatic actor in the digital age? My argument is that the answer is broader and more complicated than we might think. To understand why bloggers matter in Greece, we need to understand the context they emerged from. Traditional media in Greece face a profound crisis of trust. Journalists are widely perceived, and I write about this in my own work, not as public servants, but as intermediaries for political and economic elites. The distance between major media figures and ordinary citizens is enormous, both socially and economically. This is not simply a Greek problem, but it is particularly acute here, and it has created something important, a vacuum. A space where independent digital voices, bloggers, citizen journalists, online commentators have stepped in and built genuine audiences precisely because they are seen as more authentic, more accessible, and less compromised than mainstream media. This is the context in which the question of influencer diplomacy becomes interesting in Greece. Before we can talk about bloggers as diplomatic actors, we need to understand what kind of influencers bloggers actually are. The literature drawing on the work of Wildman, Hennings, and Langner and the WOWMA Influencer Guidebook identifies 3 main types of digital opinion leaders. First, the social butterfly, someone who connects across many different audiences and topics, building a wide network. Second, the opinion leader, a domain expert with a loyal following, the type most sought after by political actors and businesses. And third, the journalist blogger, a writer who produces analytical long-form content and whose primary influence flows not to mass audiences, but to other opinion leaders. The third type is where most serious bloggers, including myself, sit. We are not influencers in the Instagram sense. We're knowledge intermediaries, and that positioning has specific implications on how we function in the diplomatic communication ecosystem. My paper draws on 3 theoretical frameworks to explain how digital opinion leadership works and why it matters for diplomacy. The first is Brahms' reactance theory, which tells us that people resist messages they perceive as imposed on them. This is why overt propaganda often backfires and why an authentic independent voice is inherently more persuasive than a state-sponsored message. The second is Maguire's inoculation theory, which argues that audiences who learn to actively counter-argue become more resistant to manipulation. Engaged readers of analytical blogs are in this sense harder to deceive. which has real implications for democratic communication. The third, and perhaps most important for my argument, is the network diffusion research of Watts and Dodds. Their key finding is this: it is not the influencer who determines whether an idea spreads, it is the receptivity of the audience network and the social value of the ideas itself. This, I will argue, is what makes bottom-up influence so significant. Let me now turn to concrete example that sits at the heart of this paper and that illustrates the connection between opinion leadership and diplomatic strategy. The German embassy in Athens awards the Eleni Vlachou Journalism Prize to a journalist with a distinguished presence in Greek media, specifically for coverage of international and European affairs. The goal, as I argue, is transparent. Journalists are classical opinion leaders, and cultivating their goodwill through prizes, recognition, and networks is a deliberate strategy to shape how Greek public discourse engages with European affairs. I call this institutionalized influencer diplomacy. It is top-down, planned, and strategic. A foreign state identifying and rewarding domestic opinion leaders to advance its communicative goals. The example is important because it shows that the connection between bloggers, opinion leaders, and diplomacy is not theoretical. It is already happening. It is just rarely named as such. Now I want to turn to something more personal and more unusual for an academic paper. I'm not a researcher of this. I'm not only a researcher of this phenomenon. I'm also a participant in it. Over more than 10 years of blogging, I have accumulated over 550,000 page views writing about topics that include media, democracy, and public discourse in Greece. I have never been paid by a government or embassy. I have never been asked to promote a political message. My agency as a blogger, my freedom to choose what to write, how to frame it, and when to speak is the foundation of whatever influence I have built. And that independence, I argue, is precisely what makes the influence credible. This is the autoethnographic dimension of the paper, using my own practice as a lens to examine what it means to function as an informal diplomatic actor without having chosen that role consciously. But I want to be precise here and move beyond assertion to evidence. The influence I'm describing is not aspirational, is documented and verifiable. Dr. Alex Christoyanopoulos at Loughborough University gave an interview for my blog in 2017 and subsequently cited that interview in his own academic work. This is what I call the full cycle. A blogger creates a platform, an international scholar engages with it, and blog content enters the academic record. Beyond this, the blog has been recognized by international figures across different fields. Alain de Benoit republished a full interview on his official website with attribution and a link back to the blog. Dr. Carol McBride republished her interview on her own site, describing me as a Greek behavioral economist, journalist, and blogger. Raymond Ibrahim noted that my stories are reproduced by over 200 Greek and European websites and blogs. This is not influenced in the abstract. This is documented cross-border circulation of ideas originating from an independent Greek blog, reaching international academic and intellectual networks. This is, I argue, is what a para-diplomatic function looks in practice. This brings me to the central argument of the paper. The power of influence lies not only in the influencer, but in the receptivity of networked audiences and the social values of the ideas being shared. This has three implications. First, top-down diplomatic communication models are insufficient on their own. You cannot simply identify an influencer, pay them, or reward them and assume the message will spread. Second, the structure of the network matters more than the status of the individual influence. And third, and this is the most important, ideas must have genuine social value to diffuse effectively. Authenticity is not a style choice, it is a structural condition of influence. This is what distinguishes the bottom-up blogger from the top-down prize recipient. One is chosen, the other chooses, and audiences often unconsciously know the difference. Methodologically, this paper combines two approaches. The first is critical literature review, drawing on scholarship in public diplomacy, influencer diplomacy, opinion leadership, and citizen journalism. The theoretical foundations I outlined, Brehm, McGuide, Watson Dodds, Lippmann, Dewey,
need to move on to the next.
anchor the analysis in established frameworks. The second is autoethnographic reflection. I use my own experience as a Greek blogger as a primary source, not to make claims about all bloggers, but to offer an inside account of the motivations, the labor, and the agency involved in independent digital writing. This dual approach allows theory and practice to interrogate each other, which I believe produces richer insights than either could generate alone. Let me close with what I believe.
We do need to move on to the next presentation.
Okay, all right.
But thank you very much. It's always wonderful to gain a practitioner's perspective on these things.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for first for the organizing team and for all the effort. My name is Yara. I'm a socio-technical researcher and peace building specialist based in Beirut, Lebanon, and a peace ambassador with the Institute for Economics and Peace, which is based in Sydney, Australia. So building on Fotini's analysis of informal actors, I will be presenting my research on intercultural emotional intelligence and the promise of influencer diplomacy in post-conflict societies. So before I dive in, let me give you a quick roadmap of what this presentation will cover. I will begin by describing the diplomatic vacuum in divided societies and how influencers have emerged as informal diplomats. I will then identify the research gap, which is the absence of emotional intercultural frameworks in influencer studies. From there, I will introduce my theoretical framework, the ICEI, or Intercultural Emotional Intelligence, and present research evidence from 87 Lebanese political and civic leaders. I will then introduce neurodiplomacy and explain how I am applying both frameworks to influencer diplomacy. And finally, I will distinguish between transactional and relational engagement, outline the theoretical contribution of this paper, and give like a quick conclusion. So let me start with the context. So Lebanon is a deeply divided society. It has 18 recognized religious sects, a 15-year civil war, and a political system built on sectarian power sharing. And this system, although it ended the war, however, it created what peace researchers, they have called negative peace, which is the absence of violence, but with no genuine reconciliation. So formal diplomatic processes are often paralyzed by sectarian interest, historical trauma, and institutional fragility. And into this vacuum, new actors have stepped in. So social media influencers have emerged as informal diplomatic actors. So they perform emotional labor across communal divides. They create and challenge narratives. They mediate between different publics, for example, between diaspora communities and those still in Lebanon. However, they can also inadvertently increase tensions. The same digital tools that enable connection can sometimes also trigger historical sensitivities. And this dual use nature of digital competencies is the central challenge here. So this brings me to the research gap. Existing frameworks for influencer diplomacy have done important work. Like we have seen scholars who have analyzed platform algorithms, content strategies, engagement metrics, and the political economy of influencer labor. However, what is missing is a framework for understanding the emotional and intercultural competencies that influencer diplomacy requires. So currently there is no existing framework that integrates emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence. No existing frameworks that applies the threat response neuroscience to explain why emotional triggers they derail or sometimes enable digital dialogue across divides. So this paper addresses that gap by applying intercultural emotional intelligence, or ICEI, and neurodiplomacy to influencer diplomacy for the first time. To address this gap, I draw on a framework that I've developed during my doctoral research, which is the ICEI. It integrates two established concepts: the emotional intelligence, which means the ability to perceive, understand, regulate, and utilize emotions, and cultural intelligence, which consists of the capability to function effectively across cultural contexts. And this framework, it combines these into a unified strategy for navigating intercultural encounters. And it was developed specifically to analyze diplomacy in divided societies like Lebanon. To develop and test the ICEI framework, I conducted a mixed method study with 87 political and civic leaders in Lebanon. We have politicians, municipal leaders, and NGO mediators. And these are precisely the actors who shape public discourse and model the competencies that influencers also need. So I used validated instruments to measure emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence, and I also conducted in-depth qualitative interviews, asking participants to describe critical incidents, moments when dialogue succeeded or failed across sectarian lines. The findings revealed like a clear pattern. So we have participants that demonstrated genuine strength, like high self-awareness and strong motivation to engage across divides. So they wanted dialogue to succeed, but they also had like significant gaps. And we are talking here about struggling to understand the emotions of those from other communities. And they also had limited concrete cultural knowledge of other groups. So they knew stereotypes, but they didn't know about their lived realities. And they were also unable to use emotions, their own or others, to facilitate the dialogue. So these gaps, they correlated directly with negotiation failures and conflict escalation. Because when a leader could not recognize that their counterpart was speaking from fear, not aggression, I noticed that the conversation, it broke down. So based on these findings, I developed a framework called neurodiplomacy, informed by the neuroscience of threat response. Neurodiplomacy explains why emotional triggers, they derail dialogue. So when we feel threatened, whether our identity, community, or narrative is under attack, our brain's natural threat response is activated. So we stop listening, we stop thinking clearly, and we react. And my research found that unmanaged emotional triggers and intercultural faux pas, fueled by historical trauma and sectarian identity, consistently disrupt negotiation processes. So conversely, stories of successful dialogue emphasize emotion regulation, perspective taking, and cultural agility. This paper applies the ICEI and neurodiplomacy frameworks to influencer diplomacy. Why? Because influencers operate in the same emotional and intercultural landscape as political leaders. They face similar challenges like triggering historical perspectives, navigating diaspora expectations, managing online backlash. And the difference here is that influencers do this in real time, in public, under the pressure of the algorithmic amplification. So the framework of ICEI provides a lens to analyze whether an influencer's digital competencies enable relational bridging or emotional dysregulation. And this is a theoretical contribution, a new way of seeing influencer diplomacy. It's not an empirical study of specific influencers. So my PhD research found that effective diplomacy in divided societies require a shift from transactional bargaining to relational engagement. So transactional approaches are positional, interest-based, short-term, and metric-driven. Relational approaches, on the other hand, are trust-based, emotion-aware, long-term, and people-centered. And I argue that the same applies to influencer diplomacy. The most productive influencer practices move from transactional engagement, chasing visibility, optimizing for outrage, to relational engagement by building trust, acknowledging complexity, and sustaining connection across divides. So influencer diplomacy that relies on emotional triggers for visibility is basically transactional, and it may generate engagement, but it undermines the relational trust that genuine peace building requires. So this paper makes a theoretical contribution applying ICEI and Eurodiplomacy to influencer studies for the first time. It fills the gap in emotional and intercultural competency frameworks, and it also has practical implications. First, we can train influencers in ICEI competencies because these skills can be taught. Second, platforms can design features that reward relational engagement, not just outrage. And third, peace builders can integrate influencer diplomacy into conflict prevention strategies. Influencers are already doing diplomatic work. The question here is whether we support them to do it well. So in conclusion, I would like to say that based on the research that influencer diplomacy is not a trend, it is like a permanent shift from it's like a permanent shift in power, actually, and influencers are already doing diplomatic work. The effectiveness of that work depends not just on reach or platform, but also on emotional and intercultural competencies, the very competencies that ICEI measures and Eurodiplomacy seeks to build. So this paper offers like a framework for analyzing and supporting influencer diplomacy. And the goal is relational validity. So not just engagement, but also to build trust, and not just to get more clicks, but also to build connection. So yes, this is it for me. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, so this presentation is primarily based on research I've conducted since 2019, examining the emergence of influencer cultures in Cuba and the reconfiguration of its public sphere. I've mainly focused on the YouTube sphere and post-digital diasporas. Cuba occupies an unusual position in any conversation about diplomacy and mediated influence, with more than 100 embassies around the world and decades of what Faye Silver has described as public diplomacy through international solidarity, mainly Cuban doctor missions abroad. The Cuban state has historically maintained considerable capacity to shape its own global image. That branding has, however, never gone uncontested. The Cuban American community in the US had already established a visible oppositional presence in traditional media long before the internet, producing counter-narratives to the official Cuban account of the island's political and economic situation. The terms of that contestation, though, were largely set by who had access to broadcast infrastructure. What shifted this picture is the digital revolution, a term that in the Cuban context refers specifically to the state-led expansion of public access to the internet, not to a broader and more diffuse digital transformation. Cubans were allowed to own cell phones only in 2008. The first navigation centers run by the state opened in 2013. Wi-Fi in public spaces appeared in late 2015, and 3G mobile connections only in December 2018, at which point global influencer industries were already mature elsewhere. This trajectory, which had unfolded over at least 2 decades in other locations, took place in Cuba within roughly 5 years. The generations that came of political age within this condensed timeline
did not develop platform cultures alongside the rest of the world. They encountered them already formed, consumed their products mainly offline through the so-called weekly package, content distributed through external devices, and improvised within conditions specific to the island, such as slow and expensive internet and an economic embargo that made monetization practices more challenging. The reconfiguration of the Cuban public sphere that followed built on an earlier sequence: the blogosphere, citizen journalism, independent digital news platforms, mainly made for or by the diaspora. But what the expansion of public internet access added was scale and a different type of actors. As Duong has noted, it allowed Cuban citizens to produce imagery of themselves beyond official channels and the exoticizing foreign gaze. What that caused over a short period was an inside culture. Content creators, YouTubers, Instagrammers, podcasters performing as cubanos de a pie, that is, ordinary Cubans, narrating everyday life, navigating scarcity and censorship, building transnational audiences that included the diaspora but were not confined to it. In most cases, performing as ordinary was a resource to avoid discussing politics, a realm owned by the state and only challenged by dissidents. For the first time, voices from inside the island were reaching international audiences directly, without diasporic or foreign mediation, or direct mediation, I mean. That inside culture, its platform grammars and vernaculars of perceived and self-proclaimed authenticity is the environment in which the figures I will focus on today emerge: the San Isidro movement and playwright Junior Garcia Aguilera. First, I would like to distance the framing of these figures from the more common description of them as activists who use the internet. That framing treats platforms as secondary channels for a politics already constituted elsewhere. In the Cuban case, however, and particularly for the generation that came of political age after 2013, platforms were and are not secondary. The political figures I examine here use the platform configuration of Cuban internet cultures for oppositional ends. Crucially, neither the Movimiento San Isidro MSI nor Junior Garcia had large personal followings on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. What they had was access to collective platforms and vehicles with large reach, and an understanding of how to use them to address transnational counterpublics and publics alike. I would describe their actions as a form of oppositional diplomacy. Their primary interlocutors were not only domestic, they addressed the diaspora, international media, human rights organizations, and policymakers, and their narratives are designed to travel. By oppositional diplomacy, I mean non-state, platform-mediated practices made in Cuba that intervene in the international imaging of the country against the state's own diplomatic apparatus. What makes these actors relevant to this symposium and to our discussion is not only that they use platforms, but that platforms are constitutive of both the political figure they have become and the diplomatic terrain on which their cases now unfold. The Movimiento San Isidro, MSI, was founded in 2018 by a group of artists, journalists, and activists based in one of the poorest neighborhoods of Old Havana, initially in opposition to a state regulation restricting independent artistic expression. Luis Manuel Otero, a self-taught performance artist, became its most visible figure. What distinguished the movement was its use of platform affordances as political tools, its reach of audiences through social media, and the offline internet circuits that Cubans had developed to circulate digital content. The November 2020 eviction of MSI members by state security, streamed live and immediately circulated abroad, triggered what became known as 27N. Some 500 artists gathering in front of the Ministry of Culture the following day, the first significant direct confrontation between independent cultural figures and the Cuban state in decades. And it was at this moment that Junior Garcia emerged as one of the key figures in the dialogue with the government. A playwright and co-host of El Enjambre, a weekly podcast that discussed the Twitter universe in Cuba, was selected to meet with the Vice Minister of Culture that evening with no visible results. Shortly after, the music video Patria y Vida, Fatherland and Life, in which MSI members participated alongside musicians, reached 5 million views and became later the anthem of the July 11, 2021 protest, the most widespread popular mobilization in Cuba in decades, erupting simultaneously in dozens of cities across the island and facilitated by social media. Luis Manuel was arrested on July 11 while attempting to join the protest and subsequently sentenced to 5 years in prison. For Junior, the same period marked a different kind of trajectory. He founded Archipelago, a Facebook group that reached over 25,000 members, and organized a civic march for change in November 21. Blocked in his home by state security on the day of the march, he fled to Madrid and has since then addressed multiple forums, including the Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy this year, maintaining a sustained international institutional presence. Luis Manuel, meanwhile, remains in prison. His appeal was rejected by the Cuban Supreme Court some days ago, despite his sentence expiring in July. His case became a point of explicit conditionality in the ongoing negotiations between the United States and Cuba, negotiations that some observers suggest may shape the conditions for an eventual political transition on the island, with or without foreign intervention. It measures, with some precision, the limits of what the Cuban government is willing to concede when international pressure moves from the rhetorical terrain to condition. To conclude, much of the existing scholarship examines cases in which states sponsor or adapt influencer practices for their own ends. The Cuban case operates in the opposite direction. Influencer practices mobilize against a state that continues to claim a near monopoly on the external representation or imaging of the nation by actors the state has formally classified as adversaries, but that are not part of the historical dissidents. The role of non-state actors contesting the external imaging of Cuba is unlikely to diminish. The island is undergoing one of its most severe economic and political crises in recent decades, and its relationship with the US remains deeply uncertain. In that context, the influence of oppositional diplomacy of the kind that I have described today briefly may well increase, not in years, but in the months to come. Thank you. Gracias. Kiitos. That's thank you in Finnish. Thanks.
Thank you very much for introducing me. And hello, everyone. My paper today is titled The Anjali-Sufi Phenomenon, a Queer Influence on India-Pakistan Diplomacy. Through purposive sampling of Instagram posts and comments, I'm going to present a qualitative discourse analysis of a case study in influencer diplomacy. The phenomenon I'm referring to is Anjali Chakra and Sufi Malik, two influencers based in the United States. They went viral as a lesbian couple in July 2019 when they posted these photos that you can see on the slides on Instagram and Twitter. I'm going to refer to both influencers by their first names because of this being their identification on the internet. In these photo shoots, both are dressed in traditional South Asian clothing, saris and lehengas. They are thus immediately identifiable as Desi or South Asian. The poses and the caption also clearly identifies them as queer through addressing a familiar narrative of coming out to oneself and to one's family. After the viral images, the couple's Instagram accounts rapidly gained followers. They amassed over 400,000 followers between their two accounts on Instagram and also launched a YouTube channel together, which gained over 100,000 followers. They were thus catapulted into the position of influencers. Through monetizing their everyday lives and earning a living through digital activity, both Anjali and Sufi participated in the new form of labor commensurate with the digital turn in neoliberal economies. They engaged in common content creation formats such as Get Ready With Me videos, as well as specific couple content creation trends such as perks of dating a girl. Over time, they accumulated brand deals and sponsorships with fashion brands, accessory and perfume brands, and even Pride events. As this comment mentions, their engagement post in 2022 featured a brand deal with the jewelers who custom designed the ring, as well as a PR deal with the Empire State Building in New York, which was the venue of the engagement. They thus monetized not just their everyday lives, but the most intimate romantic aspects of it, which was central to their roles as influencers. Through the representation of their relationship, Anjali and Sufi harnessed the features and algorithms of Instagram for the formation of queer publics. They became the most recognized South Asian sapphic couple on the internet. This queer presence in itself is political, since, as Gajala et al. Note, digital visibility creates global awareness and highlights the specific conditions of particular groups of people and their struggles within local hierarchies. The couple's visibility created awareness of the complex intersections of their identities, such as Sufi's identity as a queer Muslim person culturally rooted in Pakistan, a country where being queer is illegal. It also formulated a specifically South Asian queer public, which challenges the cultural stigma and the legal and political barriers that LGBTQ people endure in South Asian countries and their diaspora communities. Anjali and Sufi thus engaged in what Duguay calls intimate affective labor, posting content that is relatable to lesbians and queer people from South Asia and providing aspirational narratives which are impossible to find in mainstream representation, both in the West and in South Asia. This is highlighted by the comments left across their posts. As Abedin and Kaveh have argued, comment sections on social media can form an aggregation of individual experiences and thus create a database of experiences that other queer youth can harness. This furthers digital visibility for the group and galvanizes efforts to improve conditions for queer people in South Asia. Thus, through their existence and intimacy, as well as the community that forms around them, Anjali and Sufi became part of the category of political influencers, which includes social media users who do not come from an institutional background and whose notoriety and fame is platform built. However, the feature of their relationship that was most politicized is the fact that Anjali is from a Bengali Indian Hindu family, while Sufi is from a Pakistani Punjabi Muslim family. Both thus belong to the two areas of South Asia that suffered violent partitions in the 20th century based on religion, Bengal in the east and Punjab in the northwest. The countries of their origins, India and Pakistan, have a hostile relationship marked by war, particularly due to territorial conflict over the state of Kashmir. This particular feature of love that crossed such hostility is identifiable as the key reason for the couple's virality from the headlines, which repeatedly identify them as an Indo-Pak couple. Sufi addressed this in a statement to the media. She said, "When Anjali and I went viral, our relationship was politicized beyond our imagination. The Hindu Muslim Pakistani Indian dynamic of our relationship was brought up in most conversations about us." As Sufi also noted, the fact of their Indian and Pakistani origins was not central to their own representation of the relationship. The couple never directly commented on India Pakistan relations and the associated hostility. Their political influence in this arena was manifested instead in the very private nature of their romantic relationship. Johanna Arneson has argued that the political potential of influencers might not always be as spokespersons for a cause or party, but rather as ideological intermediaries. I argue that Anjali and Sufi became ideological intermediaries on India-Pakistan relations. Their private intimacy endorsed a peaceful relationship between India-Pakistan and Hindu Muslims by highlighting shared roots and exchange of cultural heritage. In her analysis of the geopolitics of South Asia, Smriti Patnaik identifies how the people of the subcontinent are divided by territorial construction of states arbitrarily drawn by colonial masters, and notes how forms of cultural and linguistic belonging transcend these state borders. However, the hegemonic narratives of nationhood in state as well as popular cultural forms, such as cinema, in both countries, reinforce the centrality of the symbolism of the border and engage in the reflexive production of otherness between the two nations. In their posts, Anjali and Sufi emphasized cultural exchange and resisted the state sanctioned hegemonic narrative of otherness. In one post, Sufi celebrated the Bengali Hindu festival of Durga Puja with Anjali's family, while in another, Anjali posted Eid celebrations held for Sufi with her own family and also with the queer found family they formed together. Anjali made videos speaking in Urdu, the national language of Pakistan, and posted their outfits to attend a Muslim wedding for which Sufi's family taught her how to appropriately cover her hair for the masjid, that is the mosque, while still looking nice. After their engagement, Anjali posted a video of her family dancing to Punjabi music in honor of their new daughter-in-law. The reference to Punjab itself elicits a recognition of the porousness of the India-Pakistan border. Punjab lies on both sides of the border between the countries, its language and culture violently bifurcated and yet creating an unbreakable link based in shared ancestry across this geopolitical space. Through this video, the couple thus engaged in the reaffirmation of shared cultural histories of the two nations divided by artificial cartographies. Through these posts, Anjali and Sufi presented a romantic relationship that has come to be imbued with geopolitical tension. Anjali and Sufi are a particularly interesting case study since South Asian feminists have often discussed how the representations of the body of a woman serve as a proxy for the national body, particularly in the discussion of sexual violence during the partitions of Punjab and Bengal. However, this couple subverted this representation. It is still the representation of a woman's body and intimacy, but one that is resistant to the heteronormative framework in which this metonymic representation has previously been addressed. Anjali became a metonym for India and Sufi for Pakistan, and their intimacy can thus be read as a radical rupture of the jagged and unruly line of control between India and Pakistan. In addition to their own posts, Anjali and Sufi also created a space in the comment section where cultural interactions take place across physical borders thanks to a revolution in communication technology that helps citizens transcend their borders through cyberspace and make contact despite the state. The comments here voice the idea of an unpartitioned South Asia, of friendship between India and Pakistan, and note the radical potential of the couple's relationship in its utter fluidity across borders of state, religion, sexuality, and gender. Their intimacy and its digital presence thus defeats the geopolitical construct of Indian and Pakistani borders and challenges the ontology of nation state that is a majoritarian construct. Anjali and Sufi's relationship thus represented a form of influencer diplomacy through the visibility of and advocacy for queer South Asian people, as well as the disruption of the hostile border between India and Pakistan. However, this diplomacy was ruptured in March 2024 when the couple announced that their wedding was cancelled and their relationship has ended. As a private romantic breakup posted to social media by an influencer couple, this announcement is traumatic. However, as a metonym for friendship and love between warring countries, for the acceptance of queer relationships in South Asian culture, and as a digital safe space for Desi queer women, this breakup is cataclysmic. Comments from followers in this moment show anger and disillusionment resulting from a personal relationship being imbued with such sociocultural and political significance. If the beginning of the relationship symbolized the disruption of hegemonic otherness between India, Pakistan, and Hindu Muslim, its end heralded the reinforcement of these forms of otherness. Sufi, in particular, was assailed with Islamophobic and lesbophobic trolling, along with abuse against Pakistanis by Indian commenters. The Anjali-Sufi phenomenon thus leaves us with questions about the pressures placed on the individual influencer as a representative of state-level interests and relations, particularly in the context of cancel culture. The politicization of private identities and intimacies in this case first resulted in a form of everyday diplomacy between digital citizens of India, Pakistan, and their diasporas. However, ultimately, this diplomacy was ruptured due to individual actions and the dissolution of the romantic relationship on which it was predicated. Thank you.
Sorry about the technical issues there. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here and listen to Dr. Hurley's share of how she conceptualizes influencer diplomacy, which is very helpful for me to improve my paper. I resonate with her idea that positioning influencer diplomacy is essential and important. Scholarship on digital diplomacy and public diplomacy has made real progress in taking digital platforms seriously. But it has not fully theorized what is distinctive about influencers as political actors. Influencers are merely studied as highly visible individuals, which underestimates how influencers' authority actually works. Aberdeen's work on internet cultures and refracted publics help identify structural conditions that makes influencers politically consequential. These include perpetual content saturation, hyper-competitive attention economies, gamified metric cultures, and widespread information distrust. Within that landscape, influencers manage visibility strategically and they produce what Aberdeen calls calibrated amateurism, which is a labor of crafting authenticity that appears raw and unscripted. This is also why influencer diplomacy deserves to be distinguished from broader digital diplomacy. This paper begins from that foundation to ask, once that visibility and credibility has been produced, how does it become politically useful for state actors? And how does that happen without those state actors visibly authoring the content? To answer this question, the paper uses a comparative case study by examining two influencer events from 2025, iShowSpeed's China tour and Chen Zhihan's mainland visits. What connects them is a recurring pattern in how governance-useful content is produced and captured across both. iShowSpeed is already well known to the audience, I believe. For the sake of brevity, I will save his introduction. What matters here is how his streams was charged of political meaning because at the content creator level, his streams are politically thin. In one moment of speed stream in Chongqing, as you can see here on the PowerPoint, standing before a ground synchronized light show, he shouted, "Oh my God," and directs his viewer to his drone feed. The political interpretation is supplied largely by viewers. A comment declares, $1 billion of CIA propaganda just eliminated by a black guy with a phone. As we turn to how the governance performed across provinces and municipalities in China, actually they were not even close. In Henan, space team failed for almost 2 hours to find a Kung Fu training venue. The stream was going down badly. Local officials intervened then and arranged space encounter with Master Liang, and then saved the whole stream. The state media commented on Space tour after his streams went viral both on Douyin and YouTube. As you can see, CGTN recycled Space content as evidence of an unfiltered China, framing themselves as appreciative audiences of content that they had not produced. We can see that state did not lead the interpretation in an official voice. It followed the audience way of talking, which is a distinct method, especially compared to wolf warrior diplomacy. The second case is Chen Zhihan, known as Guanzhang. He is a prominent right-wing media personalities with a strong record of anti-DPP in Taiwan. When he announced his Shanghai visit in June 2025, he framed it as a fact-checking mission. He would go to the mainland to test whether DPP claims about the livelihood there were accurate. At a conference by the State Institution of Taiwan Affairs Office, the spokesperson, Mrs. Zhu, was given a window by a journalist to comment on Chen's visit and his anti-DPP function. However, she said, "I saw that Mr. Chen had arrived in Shanghai yesterday. I wish him a smooth and pleasant trip." The journalist's invitation to go further was declined by Mrs. Zhu. That kind of restraint and the reticence was itself a unique kind of governance act. So although these two cases differ in various ways, they reveal that how the state helps shape conditions without openly authoring the influencer events, which appears independent. The state did not intervene in the natural process of how influencers work on the digital platform. Instead, the state let the influencers' content naturally ferment. And the state later take up the legitimacy that the influencers did not generate for them, but that the state could nonetheless use. This recurring pattern is what my paper intends to conceptualize. I propose two terms to encapsulate the two sides of such pattern. The first is low signature governance, which refers to the state's absence in visible authorship over the primary act of mediation. While in the backstage, it creates enabling conditions for influencers and allows platform infrastructures to translate such a digital spectacle into political legitimacy. The absence of visible state authorship is not incidental. It is the structural condition that makes influencers' content credible. The second term is calibrated reticence, which refers to the state's deliberate, delayed, register-matched appropriation of credibility it did not produce. Here, the key point is that the state could claim more during the whole influencer event. It could openly declare that influencer's content validates its own style of governance, or it could directly endorse the creator's political function, which is more familiar to us as we have both seen in the pattern of wolf warrior diplomacy. But as we know in the common sense, overclaiming could damage the credibility that makes the content valuable. So the state speaks later, more selectively, and often in the audience's tone rather than its own official way of PR. I borrowed the expression of calibrated from Aberdeen's concept of calibrated amateurism. Aberdeen shows that the labor of appearing authentic and unscripted is a professional practice at the creator level. This paper plans to extend that logic to the institutional level and to the nowadays geopolitical landscape. As I showcased, the state also performs a calibrated appearance of being reticent and restrained, which seems quite similar in Aberdeen's research as a deliberative action. What is also similar is that such calibrated behavior produce favorable outcomes for the state as well. Sorry about the technical issue, and I believe my time is over. Thank you for listening. Thank you.